Hello, and thank you for your interest in this session. My name is Amanda Welsh, and I'm with a researcher with the Center for the Future of Higher Education and Talent Strategy at Northeastern. I'm here to share with you some research from the center conducted along with my colleagues, Shannon Alpert, Ann Nanovic, and Jamie Warner. Essentially, we find ourselves in a moment where there is a bit of a societal dialogue about reducing or right-sizing job description requirements, eliminating requirements for college degrees, alongside a desire to increase the diversity of employees inside companies. This has been shown to benefit the performance of the company alongside meeting any kind of social good objective that might be desired. And in addition, we see an incredible growth in the past number of years in micro-credentials, non-degree learning opportunities, credentialed non-degree learning opportunities that students can take advantage of. And by some estimates, more than half of the US workforce has now earned one of these credentials. Given this landscape where we're looking to revise the requirements for hiring and the ways that candidates can express their capabilities in hiring, we thought it was important to understand how hiring managers, those managers on the front line making the decisions to hire or not, are what they're thinking about microcredentials, what they understand about microcredentials, and really to parse whether or not they're using or considering microcredentials in their hiring decision making. In order to try to unpack that question, we fielded a survey in February, and we targeted speaking to 1,250 hiring managers across the US. And hiring managers were defined as making a hiring decision and then managing that individual on a team or managing a team of individuals. In other words, we were looking specifically to screen out anyone who had an HR function or had hiring as their only professional responsibility inside the company. We wanted to, and in sharing this with you today, I hope the learning that you take away is a bit of an understanding about how the organizations that you work with are thinking about these credentials that you almost certainly are building. So to begin, the first point to understand is that hiring managers, by and large, are very happy with their current hiring process. This may not be true in the C-suite. It may not be true in terms of some of the dialogue in the HR community or in the popular press about challenges associated with hiring or challenges in sort of the availability, the availability of labor. But the hiring managers themselves are feeling pretty positive about their processes. They feel like they are getting the job done. When we probe specifically about various aspects of the processes that they take, they feel very positively about the way that they're communicating opportunities to people. You can see here, there is a lot of purple coloring indicating that managers are satisfied or very satisfied with elements of communicating job opportunities in terms of whether or not they are restricting their use of jargon, including using inclusive or gender neutral language, asking for the essentials that they're looking for and not overloading the descriptions or the opportunity descriptions with unnecessary frills, limiting education to the requirements and coming up and sort of right-sizing the level of the role. In addition to feeling that they're pegging their education requirements properly in the job descriptions that they're crafting, managers also feel that they're finding the right level and are not inappropriately screening candidates out by the requirements that they are seeking. So just barely under a quarter of the respondents had any kind of concern that candidates who might be able to do the jobs that they were looking to fill were being screened out by education requirements. And this was true whether or not the manager used an applicant tracking system. So another component of the hiring process is that in the past decade, seeking a job has really come to rely on a flow of data through an HR hiring technology platform of one kind or another. And a key technology and applicant tracking system has occasionally been identified as a bit of a culprit in the way that candidates are filtered. So if you post a job and you have 3,000 applicants, but you really only have the bandwidth as a hiring manager to talk to 5 of the applicants, you need some way to winnow down from 3,000 to 5. And the ATS systems offer a variety of mechanisms to do this, one of which is a toggle on whether or not a candidate has earned a college degree. What we see is among those managers who are using an applicant tracking system, there is a slightly higher number of managers who are concerned that this filtering process is eliminating candidates who might, in fact, be good candidates for the role that they're seeking to fill. But it's still only when we look at those managers who express concern often or very often, it's still only about a third of managers. So by far and away, the majority of managers are happy with their hiring process and think that their tools are performing reasonably well and that they are defining the opportunity in the right way. As a consequence of that, not surprisingly, a majority of managers haven't thought about reducing education requirements, or if they've thought about it, are hesitant to try to do anything with it. So we see that there's not a tremendous sense of motivation for them to not require a college degree and consider a micro-credential instead. In contrast to where managers are happy or somewhat content, if you will, they do very clearly identify challenges in the hiring work that they do. And the first and foremost challenge that they articulate is finding qualified candidates. So frequently, what they will say, or what they told us, was that they are finding enough candidates. They have no problem with the simple number of people who are applying. Not that many are concerned about the diversity of the candidate pool, and not that many are concerned about the time that it takes to find candidates. Rather, the ones who are responding to the job descriptions, the job openings that they're posting, are coming in with some, but not all, of the capabilities or background that they are looking for. One manager described this as, we've had to become a lot more lenient on our requirements because we're seeing so few qualified individuals looking for work. So what they're articulating here is not a lack of people applying, but there is some tension for them in how they are identifying those people that they think might be able to do the job that they're seeking to fill. You can see how there's a little bit of tension here between articulating quality as a problem and being very comfortable with the education requirements that they are placing in the job descriptions that are getting posted. In addition, when we looked at the challenges, we saw that there wasn't a great sense among the hiring managers that finding diverse candidates was a problem for them. We also see that equity isn't a tremendous focus for them as they are evaluating the candidate. So when they get a candidate, an applicant who's graduated to the candidate stage, and they're beginning an active process of evaluation, along the lines of looking for qualified candidates, you can see that demonstrating competency is by far and away the topic of most concern that they want to address in their evaluation process. And way down at the bottom of the list is bringing a different perspective among the managers. So this is also, we can understand that there's a little bit of tension here between the nature of this hiring process and the way that managers are using it, and potentially some of the higher, more strategic objectives set by executive leadership in a company. So when a company is looking to remove or reduce education requirements in their job descriptions in the spirit of fostering greater diversity in the employee base that they are embracing, you can see that that's not really translating yet to the activity and the mindset of the hiring manager. So given that we've got this disconnect, how can we reconcile these higher level strategic objectives, which may be set by executive leaders in companies or HR leaders in companies, with the day-to-day reality of how the hiring manager is executing? Well, we would like to suggest, we'd like to think that micro-credentials do offer a way to give a manager insight into the capabilities of a candidate, and so we want to unpack, we want to understand a little bit better than how they may be leveraging this. Micro-credentials in our definition are a category of educational or professional credential that is smaller than a degree. And I will say when we fielded this survey, we had a pretty broad definition of micro-credential. It could include professional licensing. It could include certificates that were offered by universities. It could include certificates that were offered by industry. If you think about, for example, a certificate in some technology that is offered by a technology company. So Microsoft will have a number of these as one example. And it might include something along the lines of a digital badge, where there's an even lower commitment or a lower investment on the part of the learner. So we did adopt a fairly broad definition. But we wanted to suggest that this represents a category, or the thing that we wanted to explore was that this represents a category for how a learner could represent themselves and is not as challenging to achieve as a degree, and so therefore may begin to address some of the equity considerations. The time and the financial resources required could be lower and might be an interesting mechanism to replace the degree as a point of evaluation or as an articulation of the education requirements that might be sought. We do make the observation that when a CEO says that their company is going to eliminate degree requirements from their jobs, as companies like IBM have done, or a number of states are now issuing executive orders which are doing that. These senior leaders are not saying to the hiring managers, I don't want you to stop evaluating candidates. And they're just saying that they don't want to use the degree as a mechanism for the evaluation or as a proxy for as a part of the evaluation. And so the interesting question then becomes, how can micro-credentials step up and play a role as a replacement for the education requirement or the degree requirement that's being removed? So you still need to evaluate, but maybe we now need a different set of tools to do the evaluation of candidates with. And micro-credentials would seem to be an interesting option. So let's look further into whether or not managers feel the same way, and whether or not managers are actually starting to do this. One of the things that we learned right away is that micro-credentials are increasingly common. I referenced at the very beginning the notion that some studies are suggesting that as many as 2/3, certainly more than half, as many as 2/3 of US workers already hold a micro-credential. And among the managers we spoke to or responded to our survey, a very large number, almost universal, we saw almost universal awareness of micro-credentials. And the way that they are using micro-credentials at the moment, there's a tremendous consistency in the responses that we got to suggest that they are using micro-credentials. Managers see micro-credentials as a way to screen for mindset, more so than to identify specific skills. So for hiring managers, they think of micro-credentials as an indication of learning mindset, discipline, or ambition. In terms of using micro-credentials more specifically, the managers did share a number of, a little bit of concern. And you can see here that across the really the 6 options that we gave managers to identify challenges that they felt in considering candidates' micro-credential as they were evaluating that candidate. None of the concerns are reaching really more than about a third of the managers. So by and large, there's a relative openness on the part of the managers to take advantage of microcredential information that's being presented to them. However, as they are trying to use the microcredentials, what we see as the top rated concern is that it is difficult to understand what skills were learned through microcredentials. And this is consistent with the observation that not many managers were really using microcredentials as an indication of skills. They were looking at microcredentials more as a class of activity that said something about the nature of the candidate's kind of personality, if you will, or something about the nature of who they were as an individual. And that's problematic if we want to encourage managers to use micro-credentials differently, because what we see is that that need to understand the skills that a micro-credential contains, and to assure that is very necessary to assure that that micro-credential is really clearly aligned to the needs of the job. And when those 2 things happen, we did see a very clear report from the managers that this made microcredentials a much more effective tool for them in their candidate evaluation process. So a good example of this would be in the IT industry. In the IT industry, there are often, with roles, specific technical capabilities that are required, and there are a number of smaller credentials, micro-credentials, which are focused on teaching learners skills about a specific technology. So if to go back to the Microsoft example, if you think about getting a certification in using Azure, that is something that is very specific and can be clearly aligned to the needs of a job. And so this is going to be an example of a really good use case that managers were very positive about, and felt that they could very productively use micro-credentials in their evaluation of candidates. What's interesting, and we can see this play out when we moved beyond asking managers about their attitudes. So we were, as we probed their awareness, we saw that it was high. When we looked at their attitudes, we saw that they considered micro-credentials as a class of activity that gave them information about a candidate's character or personality, less so about their capabilities. We then dug into how they were using credentials. So in addition to awareness and attitude, we then wanted to probe on their adoption of considering micro-credentials in hiring. And in order to understand this, we did unpack various factors that condition the way a hiring manager will behave. So certain industries have certain constraints, for example, and it felt important to look at the way managers considered micro-credentials split by industry. And what we see when we look at the split by industry, something very interesting in the IT sector, which I think plays out the observation about alignment that that we had uncovered when we were looking at the attitude and the challenges of considering micro-credentials. So on the left-hand side of the screen, you see a chart which is giving you insights into whether or not managers felt that a degree better prepares candidates. So we posed the question, do you agree or disagree on a scale of 1 to 5? Do you agree or disagree that a college degree better prepares a candidate for a job than a micro-credential? And overwhelmingly, managers are agreeing, although you do see some very interesting pockets. If we look at, there are two that I want to consider in particular. One is the IT, the information sector, and the other is construction. So in the information sector, you see that there's indeed a really high percentage of managers who said, yes, I agree, a college degree better prepares a candidate for a job. And yet, when we go over to the chart on the right-hand side of the screen and look at the information sector, we can see that they are hiring micro-credential candidates to a greater degree than the other, let's call them white-collar professions, which are displayed on the chart. So in the healthcare sector, or in professional services, or finance and insurance, somewhere between 22 and 31% of managers are reporting that sometime in the past 3 years, they've hired a candidate who only presents with a micro-credential, i.e., they have not earned a college degree. They're presenting, they have education experiences from micro-credentials or in micro-credential form. So this is very interesting, and I think really speaks to the power of that alignment of the skills to the job, and how the attitude of or let's call it a bias toward degrees on the part of the hiring manager can be overcome when we've got a really strong alignment between the micro-credential and the needs of the job. I will call out here that none of the data that I'm talking about in this presentation, or excuse me, rather, all of the data that I'm speaking about in this presentation has achieved a threshold of statistical significance. So the difference between 37% of managers and the 31% of managers is indeed a real difference that we can rely on. In contrast, or I guess in addition, another insight that we can derive when we look at the industry segmentation here is that construction, and a little bit more so, a little bit in retail, and a little bit less so in manufacturing, those are the ones that we would group together in sort of more of a kind of blue collar perspective, if you will. But we do see that in construction, there is a very strong alignment between the number of managers who believe are biased toward a degree, that being lower. It's one of the lowest among the segments that we considered, and that translating to a higher number of employment of these types of candidates. This is a really good example of where the nature of an industry and some of the traditions in an industry come to play. So in construction, there is a very long history going back more than a century of licensing tradesmen, which has offered the construction industry this sort of very rich vocabulary, awareness, and indeed a long history of usage or reliance upon a micro-credential to indicate a worker's capacity. So that's something to call out and is interesting to note. But what we see in the example of the information sector is that your industry is not your destiny, if you will. and that a sort of a traditional bias toward a college degree in a white collar kind of employment opportunity can in fact be overcome when there is that really strong alignment between micro-credential and the job that you're trying to fill. Next, we considered another characteristic which has sometimes been described as a conditioning factor for whether or not managers are likely to hire micro-credential only candidates, and that is age. So it's been suggested in some prior research that younger managers are more inclined, they're more, let's say, accustomed to the concept of a micro-credential and are therefore more inclined to consider candidates with micro-credentials only, presenting only micro-credentials. So we then looked at age as a characteristic of the hiring manager and tried to unpack their hiring activity as well. And I will say that one of the things that came forward was this idea of whether or not you like education at all. And so we have this quote, "I've come to the conclusion it doesn't matter if you have a 4-year degree or you just have a high school diploma. It's all about the knowledge of the person. I've had people work for me who didn't even have a high school education, and they knew more than the person who had the 4-year degree." What's interesting to note is that this quote came from a manager who was over 60 years of age. And this is a way to suggest that some of the observations about younger managers being more comfortable with micro-credentials because for one reason or another may not in fact be completely correct. Or there's a bit of nuance there that we want to consider. So when we look at a segmentation by age and unpack whether or not managers are expressing any kind of a bias toward a degree, what you see right away is that the group expressing the greatest amount of bias toward a degree is actually the 18 to 27-year-old group. So again, a little bit contrary to what we might have imagined, given some of the research that's been conducted so far or to date. And what we find here as we were thinking about this, I think it's important to recall that we had screened all of our respondents to be actively hiring and managing teams of people. So it's not that far a leap to imagine that anyone who is fairly early in their career, under 27 years old, probably has a university degree or a college degree. And so if you yourself have earned a college degree and you're not that far removed from that experience, it's not that big a leap to think to imagine that you're going to believe that this was a good thing to have done and that that goodness should translate to other people as well. So the fact that someone who is fairly freshly out of a college degree experience should be biased to believe in the value of that college degree kind of makes a bit of sense. What's curious then, and I think leads to some of the earlier conclusions that we might have seen in the research, is when we look at the actual hiring behavior, so not so much their bias towards a degree, but their actual hiring pattern in the chart, as shown in the chart on the right-hand side of the screen, we see that indeed the younger managers are actually hiring more people with only micro-credentials. They are also, by the way, hiring more people with degrees plus micro-credentials. But when we look specifically at almost half of the younger managers, 43%, who've indicated that sometime in the past 3 years, they've hired someone who presented only a micro-credential, that's an interesting finding. As we unpacked the data, what seemed to be the case is that younger managers are doing more hiring for entry-level roles than their older peers. And in entry-level roles, there is across industry and across age, there is definitely more tolerance for lower levels of education. And so we think that it's sort of that structural condition that younger managers tend to be hiring more junior workers that is leading toward a greater embrace of micro-credential only candidates as they're selecting whom they choose to hire. So it's not so much a function of age and perhaps a little bit more a function of the nature of the hiring that they are undertaking. That then brings us, but that does give us a little bit of a peek at one of the things that we found in the data, and is, I think, the more striking finding, and the one that I'd like to really make sure that I leave you with in this presentation. And that is the importance of personal experience and how that impacts us. So we saw that potential bias toward degrees based on the personal experience of the younger managers. Along those lines, that led us to ask the question about whether or not managers who are hiring have themselves earned a micro-credential. And what we found was that this had an extraordinary impact on their hiring activity. So they may still express a belief in the value of a degree, but when you look at their actual hiring behavior, you can see that there is a class of manager. Those who, I guess, if we look at the chart on the right-hand side, you can see if you look at those who didn't earn a micro-credential, they are hiring a very low number of micro-credential only candidates. If they're unsure whether or not they earned a micro-credential, so the grouping at the far right of that chart, they are also hiring a low number of micro-credential only candidates. And if they've earned a micro-credential, but they were unsure of the impact that it had on their career, they are behaving very similarly to those managers who didn't earn the micro-credential or were just confused about the concept. In contrast, you can see that roughly double the number of managers or rather that the number of managers who earned a micro-credential and felt that it had a positive impact on their career is roughly double the managers in the other segments. And so this leads us to really the understanding that human nature is sort of delightfully predictable in this regard, and that is we do what we know. And if we have earned a micro-credential and we felt it positively impacted our career, it was an important and useful thing to have done, we then approach candidates with micro-credentials much different, or in a much more positive way than someone who has had no experience with them, or a neutral to even possibly negative experience with them. And what that means then, what that translates to for us as educators then, is as we're engaging with organizations who may be consumers of our micro-credentials. So as we're engaging with companies who are interested in having us train their employees, or if anyone participating here is responsible for a group of employees and their training, we can see that for the companies, the hiring processes that they might adopt to adjust managers, there are some best practices that can be followed. But on the right-hand side of the screen, what we see really clearly is that those companies who have invested in tuition assistance for micro-credentials are when we look at the managers who are hiring micro-credential only candidates, they are working for companies where the company is sending a really clear signal that earning a micro-credential is important. In these companies, we are seeing tuition assistance for micro-credentials. That's that 40% purple bar on the far right. compared to 31% of managers who are doing this kind elsewhere. So generally speaking, across the pool, the tuition assistance for micro-credentials was about a third. But in those companies where the managers are actively hiring candidates, we see a considerably stronger representation of this particular type of professional development program. So the sort of takeaway here is that companies can support their hiring managers in using micro-credentials if they, A, are helping managers understand the alignment between what a micro-credential teaches and the roles that they're trying to fill, and B, send a very clear signal that micro-credentials are important and useful in your professional development, in your career progression in a company. So these two components seem to be very necessary components or important components in driving better consideration, more productive consideration of micro-credentials in hiring. And a side effect, certainly, of encouraging your managers, your existing employee base, which will include your managers in earning a micro-credential, is that you are then, in addition, altering their own personal experience base, which we have identified correlates very highly with the activity that you then undertake in terms of the candidates that you end up selecting in your hiring process. So if we want to translate this then to how educators listening to this talk may want to work with this information, leverage this information in the micro-credential work that they're doing, we have three recommendations. We net out at three recommendations. The first is that as you engage with companies to create training programs, as you engage with companies to articulate why your existing training programs are of interest or value to a company, prioritize aligning the skills that you are teaching to the roles that the company is trying to fill. And that alignment will give the micro-credential more authority in the candidate evaluation process. It will be used more actively and will return greater value, not only to you as an institution, but to the hiring manager in filling the role and filling the roles that they're seeking to fill. Similarly, as you are engaging with companies, working with companies to recognize your credentials, so to consciously articulate not only to do the work of understanding the alignment, but to consciously articulate that alignment to hiring managers, and as well as part of a professional development support program that the company is likely putting into place, will allow you to take that second step of actualizing the impact of the micro-credential and in a way that should translate into changed hiring behavior, more expansive hiring behavior. And then finally, to the extent that you can, as you are engaging with companies, it is important to encourage companies to reference these micro-credentials, your micro-credentials, in job descriptions. And indeed, I think there's an opportunity really to offer to field an experiment where referencing a micro-credential specifically, in undertaking the activity of referencing a micro-credential in a job description and evaluating, if indeed the candidate pool has changed or the candidates selected have changed. Because by referencing the micro-credential, again, there's that connection of the value of the alignment between the micro-credential and the open role. There is the affirmation on the part of the company that this is a good and valuable thing to do. But in addition, there's also a communication to your potential candidates. And that is you're giving the candidates very clear guidance on micro-credentials that they can go and pursue to have a productive conversation with you as a potential employer. And this is great for the employee. This is great for that learner employee applicant because it's very empowering. They have clear guidance on how to move forward, and that guidance has that lower barrier for achievement. That means that candidates who may be in a more diverse, may fall into a more diverse category, will have the potential to accomplish this with lower friction and some of the fewer impediments than requiring that they go after a college degree would have. So it's very empowering for the user in many ways, which should improve the candidate pipeline, and that will then ultimately get at and begin to address that primary point of pain that the hiring managers, who, remember, were by and large reasonably happy, but this can help you address that primary point of pain of finding candidates whom they feel are appropriately qualified. It is a win-win-win scenario for all involved. Sorry about that. So thank you very much. There is now on the screen a QR code that will connect to our full report. I have actually given you only a peek at the data and the argumentation that we provide in that full report as we try to unpack the power of micro-credentials in the hiring conversation. I'm also including my email, and I would be delighted to correspond with anyone listening to this talk who has questions or an interest in understanding the work of the Center for the Future of Higher Education and Talent Strategy further. Thank you very much for your time.